By 1900, a small village on a Maine island held some of the most concentrated private wealth per acre found anywhere in the United States. More than 200 summer residences stood along its shore, built by families named Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Astor, Pulitzer, and Morgan. One estate was expanded in 1927 to 80 rooms. Another was a stone castle with a tower its owners named the Tower of Silence. The village itself held only a few thousand year-round residents, none of whom owned property on the shorefront the summer people called Millionaire's Row. Today, that same shorefront is lined with motels. In October 1947, within a single week, 67 of its 222 summer cottages were destroyed. 5 hotels were destroyed. 170 year-round houses were destroyed. $23 million in property, in the currency of 1947, burned in a matter of days. This is the story of how a private paradise built by America's richest families collapsed in a single autumn, and why the families who could have rebuilt it chose not to. Chapter 1. A Mountain Out of the Sea. Mount Desert Island sits off the coast of Maine, and along the entire length of the American Atlantic seaboard, it does something no other landmass does. Its highest point, a granite dome rising to over 1,500 feet, climbs directly out of the ocean, with no foothills to soften the ascent and no gradual plain standing between summit and shore. Rock meets water, and then rock simply keeps going up. Samuel de Champlain sailed past it in 1604, ran his ship aground on a ledge nearby, and named the place Isle des Monts Déserts, the island of bare mountains, for the granite summits scraped clean of trees by wind and altitude. For 236 years afterward, that was the extent of its fame, a navigational hazard with an evocative French name, fished by a scattering of families, ignored by everyone with money. What changed it was paint, not commerce. In the 1840s and 1850s, the Hudson River School painters, Thomas Cole first, Frederick Edwin Church after him, began traveling north to the island and returning with canvases of its cliffs and light. Those canvases hung in galleries in New York and Boston, where they were seen by exactly the audience capable of acting on what they saw. Men who had made fortunes in shipping, banking, and manufacturing, and who now had the leisure and the means to go looking for the landscapes hanging on their walls. They started making the trip themselves, by steamer and then by rail, and they gave themselves a name before anyone else could give it to them. They called themselves rusticators, a word that flattered its own modesty. Nothing about what followed would stay modest for long. The village they were arriving in was called Eden, founded in 1796 as a fishing settlement and not renamed Bar Harbor until 1918. It had no accommodations built for the purpose of receiving strangers. In 1855, an innkeeper named Tobias Roberts corrected that, opening the Agamont House on the shorefront, the island's first hotel, built for an audience that did not yet fully exist but was already, by then, on its way. It existed within a decade. By 1868, the rusticators were no longer content to rent rooms by the week. A Boston merchant named Alpheus Hardy built Birch Point that year, the island's first private summer residence, and in doing so, he did not simply build a house. He established a precedent, a demonstration that a man of sufficient means could own his own piece of this granite coastline, rather than borrow it from an innkeeper, and the demonstration was followed. It was followed relentlessly. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, construction moved along the shore at a pace the village had never seen and would never fully absorb, cottage after cottage, rising where fishing shacks and spruce woods had been. The words survived the transition. The buildings did not. What went up were not cottages in any sense the word had previously meant. They were houses of 20 rooms, then 40, then 80, built of shingle and stone, by architects trained in Boston and New York, and the modest word was kept on purpose. A deliberate, almost private joke among people who did not need to advertise what they had built. By 1880, the village that had held no hotel 25 years earlier held 30 of them, filled every summer with a clientele the hotels themselves could no longer contain. That clientele was about to stop renting altogether. The families arriving in the 1880s were not merchants and professionals anymore. They came from Wall Street, from Standard Oil, from railroads and steel, and they were about to give a stretch of shorefront just west of the village a name that would outlast every hotel Tobias Roberts had ever imagined. Chapter 2. The Address That Replaced Newport. In 1886, the town cut a street along the harbor's western edge and called it, without ceremony, West Street. It ran barely half a mile, hugging the water at Frenchman Bay, and within a season the lots that fronted it were selling for more than any ground in the village had ever brought. Merchants and sea captains had built inland, on higher ground, out of habit and modesty. The new buyers wanted the shoreline itself, unbroken, so that a man could stand on his own lawn and watch the tide come in without another roof between him and the horizon. The name Millionaire's Row was not official. It did not need to be. George Sullivan Bowdoin arrived at Bar Harbor already carrying 2 inheritances he had not earned, and one he had. He was a great-grandson of Alexander Hamilton, and he was a partner in the banking house of J.P. Morgan, a position that made his signature worth more than most men's entire estates. In 1902, he commissioned a cottage on West Street from Andrews, Jacques and Rantoul, the Boston firm that had already built for half of State Street. He did not haggle over the design. He had not haggled over much in 30 years. George Vanderbilt bought the old Ogden property on the same stretch of shore and stripped it of its name. Ogden had been a family, a modest claim to the harbor going back decades. Vanderbilt renamed the estate Point d'Acadie, and the new name stuck the way money sticks, quietly, permanently, without a vote. After Bowdoin and Vanderbilt came the rest, and they came the way weather comes, one front behind another. The Astors came carrying a name older than most of the fortunes now arriving beside it. The Fords followed, their name newer than any of them, built in a single generation out of steel and assembly line. Behind them came the Pulitzers, bringing a newspaper empire's worth of opinions about who else belonged on that street. By the last years of the 1880s, editors along the eastern seaboard had started calling Bar Harbor the one resort colony that could stand beside Newport without apology. Not its equal in ballroom marble, not yet, but its only rival in the roster of names willing to spend a summer there. They kept calling their houses cottages. The word had described modest wooden buildings when Tobias Roberts was renting rooms to Harvard professors, and it went on describing houses of 20 and 30 and 40 rooms after the professors stopped coming. Nobody on West Street corrected the usage. It was, in its way, the most expensive word in Maine, a term of understatement wielded by people who understated nothing else about their lives, and it would outlive most of the buildings it was built to describe. By the time Edward T. Stotesbury, a Philadelphia banker with a taste for scale that even his neighbors found difficult to match, took possession of a shingled cottage called Wingwood House, on that same shore, West Street had stopped being a real estate experiment and become a fact of American geography. What Stotesbury would eventually do to that house, the wings, the room count, the year it stopped resembling a cottage in anything but name, belonged to a later decade. For now the house stood as built, one more roof line among the new ones rising along the water. Somewhere in a Bar Harbor office, a young architect named Fred Savage was already drafting the plans that would turn this stretch of shore from wealthy into unforgettable. Chapter 3. The Cottages Become Castles. Fred Savage had grown up on Mount Desert Island watching schooners unload lumber for other men's summers, and by the 1890s he was the architect those summers ran through. He did not train in Boston or study under the masters who signed the grandest commissions along the eastern seaboard. He learned the coastline itself, the granite ledges and the fog patterns and the particular way northern light fell across a shingled gable at 5 in the afternoon. He would eventually put his name on dozens of cottages scattered across the island, each one a negotiation between a client's ambition and the rock underneath it. Reverie Cove, raised in 1895 in a colonial revival that borrowed its columns and symmetry from an older, calmer America, was one answer to that negotiation. It would not be the largest house Savage built, and it would not be the last. What came next was not really building anymore. It was accumulation. Stotesbury's Wingwood House, modest by comparison when it was first raised, entered the 1920s as one cottage among many, and left the decade as something closer to an institution. By 1927, it held 80 rooms, including a 30-room wing built for no purpose, but housing the staff required to run the other 50. 56 electric wall heaters were wired into walls that had never needed them. 5 separate hot air furnace systems worked in parallel beneath floors no single family could fill. And 26 marble fireplaces, carved in Europe and shipped across an ocean, warmed rooms that stood empty most of the year. Wings for the family, wings for the guests, wings, in the end, for the staff whose sole task was maintaining wings. Chatwold answered Wingwood House with a different argument. Where Stotesbury built horizontally in additions and annexes, the Chatwold cottage built upward in stone, until it resembled less a summer residence than a fortification against a siege that never came. Its towers rose over the tree line in a way no shingled roofline could, and the tallest of them earned a name of its own, the Tower of Silence, a phrase visitors used without quite explaining what the silence was for or from what the tower was meant to guard. A castle on a coastline built for cottages said something about the colony that no ledger of room counts could. It said the imitation of old-world permanence had become the point. All of it required somewhere to be seen. The Bar Harbor Club supplied that stage, a clubhouse where tennis courts and a saltwater pool and a dining room did the ordinary work of any resort association, except that the membership rolls read like a registry of American fortune itself. Rockefeller sat beside Pulitzer on those lists, banking beside publishing, one generation's railroad money beside another's newsprint money, all of it filed alphabetically as though proximity on a page could make old money and new money indistinguishable. For a few hours each evening, it nearly did. By the late 1920s, Bar Harbor had built itself past the point of return, past the boarding houses of the 1870s, past the first shingled experiments of Stotesbury's neighbors, into a landscape of towers and marble, and 56 heaters warming rooms no one occupied past September. Somewhere down West Street, past the last of Savage's gambrel roofs, the club's lit windows would still be burning after most of the cottages had gone dark for the night. A different kind of visitor was already walking that same shoreline with a different question in mind. Not what the island's summer people had built, but what the island itself might need protecting from. Chapter 4. The Man Who Bought the View. Picture West Street on an August evening in the 1900s. The cottages stand lit window after window, their reception rooms bright with electric light that had reached the island only a few summers before. Gas lamps and open flame already a memory for the families who could afford to forget them. Beyond the lawns, the harbor holds its own constellation. Schooner yachts riding at anchor, lanterns strung along their rails, brass fittings catching what light spills from the shore. Carriages wait at the curbs, drivers idle in the dark beside them, and behind the houses, a second population moves without being seen. Maids carrying trays up back stairs, coachmen walking horses to cool them, kitchen boys hauling ice from the sheds. The music from one drawing room reaches halfway down the block before it meets the music from the next, and the two blur into something neither host intended. Somewhere in that noise and light, a rocky, wooded interior of the island sits entirely dark, unlit, and unclaimed by anyone's ledger, waiting to be logged, subdivided, or ignored. Whichever came first. It was that darkness, not the light, that occupied George B. Dorr. Born into a Boston family whose fortune had already been made before he was old enough to add to it, Dorr had spent his early decades as a gentleman horticulturist, tending gardens, cultivating rare plants, living the unhurried life available to a man who never needed to work for money. In 1901, at an age when most of his class had settled into permanent leisure, he began doing something almost no one else on the island was doing: buying land not to build on it, but to leave it alone. He bought parcels, threatened by timber sales, accepted donations from owners, persuaded to give rather than sell, and spent his own fortune down protecting acreage that produced no income and never would, petitioning and organizing in whatever hours were left over. Dorr did not work alone. He found in Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard and a summer resident himself, a partner who understood how to move an idea through institutions. He found in John D. Rockefeller Jr. a partner who understood how to move money. Rockefeller did not simply write checks. He personally financed and helped design 52 miles of carriage roads across the island's interior, graded and stone-bridged for horse-drawn travel, built on the explicit condition that no automobile would ever be permitted to use them. Where the cottages down West Street measured their worth in marble and heating capacity, this land trust measured itself in acres kept empty. By 1916, Dorr and Eliot's land company had transferred more than 6,000 acres to the federal government, first designated a national monument, then in 1919 established outright as Lafayette National Park, the first national park east of the Mississippi River, carved not from wilderness the government already controlled, but from land one private citizen had spent 15 years quietly assembling parcel by parcel. Dorr, who had never built a cottage or hosted a ball on West Street, became the park's first superintendent, a title that suited a man who had spent his fortune buying the one thing on the island not for sale to anyone else. In 1929, the park took the name it still carries, Acadia National Park, a designation meant to outlast any single donor's memory. That same year, a different kind of transaction was working its way through the ledgers of the men who had built the cottages Dorr's land now framed. Chapter 5. A Fortune Erased. That transaction, when it closed, was smaller than what had come before it. A lot sold, a staff reduced, an insurance policy allowed to lapse. It was not the only one. 16 years earlier, in 1913, the ratification of the 16th Amendment had introduced the federal income tax, a mechanism that reached for the first time directly into the fortunes that had built West Street's 200 cottages. The tax began modestly. It did not stay modest. By the time the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the households that had once treated their summer expenditures as beneath calculation were doing arithmetic they had never needed before. The erosion did not announce itself. It moved through the household ledgers, the way water moves through limestone, unseen until the structure above it gives way. Families that had employed 100 servants across kitchen, stable, and garden began quietly to close wings. And a guest wing shuttered for one season became a guest wing shuttered permanently. Then, a cottage itself. 30 rooms built for a summer that no longer required 30 rooms, went dark for good, its furniture under sheets, its staff let go with references, and, where the family could still manage it, a final month's wages. None of it was announced. The colony's social calendar continued to function on its surface. The same regattas, the same receptions, the same names printed in the same newspapers. Underneath, the ledgers told a different story. The paradox sharpened in 1930 when the village of Eden, renamed Bar Harbor at the turn of the century, recorded its highest population in its history, 4,486 residents, the peak of a curve that had risen steadily since the first cottages went up. The number arrived precisely when the economic foundation beneath it had already begun to crack. A village grows on the wages of building, serving, and maintaining a colony of fortunes. It does not immediately register when those fortunes stop expanding, only when they stop altogether. In 1930, Bar Harbor was, by the census, at its fullest. It was also, by the ledgers few residents could see, already hollowing. The next 16 years passed with the appearance of continuity and the fact of subtraction. Cottages changed hands, or did not change hands and simply closed, their owners paying taxes on structures they no longer opened. Some were sold for a fraction of their construction cost to buyers who wanted the land and not the building. Others sat empty through winter after winter, heated just enough to keep the pipes from bursting, staffed by a caretaker where 100 servants had once worked. The colony grew smaller in substance while its address remained the same. In 1946, the pattern reached Chatwold. The stone castle with its tower of silence was demolished. Timber, stone facing, and a turret built to shut out sound, reduced to a cleared lot on a hillside that had once held one of the colony's most singular houses. It was among the first of the great cottages to go, a demolition carried out deliberately, on the owner's terms, at a moment of their choosing. No fire took it. No accident forced the decision. It came down because the fortune that had built it could no longer justify keeping it standing, and because there was, by then, a growing list of cottages meeting the same end by the same quiet calculation. Chatwold's demolition closed out 1946. What came for the rest of the colony would not wait for anyone's calculation and would not come quietly. It was 1 year away. Chapter 6. Smoke over the Barrens. At 4 o'clock on the afternoon of October 17, 1947, a woman living near the edge of what was becoming Acadia National Park noticed smoke rising from a cranberry bog on the boundary of her property and telephoned it in. No one would ever settle what had started it. The two theories that circulated afterward, a cigarette dropped by a cranberry picker and left to smolder in the peat, or a town dump left to burn unattended for too long, were never confirmed, and the bog itself offered no evidence either way. It simply smoked, thin and gray above ground that had gone weeks without meaningful rain, drought conditions that had settled over the whole of Mount Desert Island that autumn without anyone treating them as an emergency. By the time a crew reached the site, the fire had already worked its way past the standing water of the bog and into the dry duff of the barrens beyond it. For 3 days, it behaved like a fire that intended to be forgotten. Men cut lines around its edges, watched the sky, and by the 3rd day had reason to think the matter closed. 169 acres burned, the perimeter holding, the smoke thinning rather than thickening. Bar Harbor's hotels stood shuttered for the season. Its cottages, what remained of them after the demolitions of the previous winter, sat empty behind hedges nobody was trimming. The fire in those first 3 days was a local matter, the kind of story that made the inside pages of the county paper and nothing more. A nuisance for the men holding shovels and rakes along its edge rather than a threat to anything the town still valued enough to protect. The wind changed that arithmetic on October 21st. It came out of the northwest with a force the fire lines had not been built to withstand, carrying sparks well ahead of the flame front and dropping them into timber that had been drying since midsummer. What had been 169 acres became more than 2,000 before the day was finished. The fire was no longer a contained problem creeping along a bog's edge. It was moving through standing forest at a pace the crews could not match, jumping the breaks they had spent 3 days digging as though the breaks were not there at all. Men who had gone home the previous evening believing the worst was behind them returned to find the worst had not yet introduced itself. There was no dramatic collapse to mark the change, no single hour that crews could point to afterward as the moment it got away from them. It was simply a gap that widened all day. The distance between where the fire had been that morning and where it stood by dusk growing faster than any line could close it, faster than trucks could be routed, faster than men could be told where to stand. By nightfall on the 21st, more than 2,000 acres had burned, and the fire showed no inclination toward the kind of exhaustion that had made it seem finished 3 days earlier. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the wind was still blowing. Chapter 7. The Wind That Spared the Shops. By the morning of October 23rd, the fire no longer behaved like something that could be reasoned with. Gusts reached 65 miles an hour, and the flames covered 5 to 6 miles in a single day. As much ground as they had taken in the 2 days before combined. Roads out of Bar Harbor closed one after another until the town found itself cut off on every side, fire standing where the highways used to run. Men who had been planning escape routes since the 17th now watched those routes disappear on the map in front of them. There was no longer a direction that led safely away from the smoke. Fishermen from Winter Harbor, Gouldsboro, and Lemoyne brought their boats in against the wharves and took people off by water. 400 of them, loaded in whatever order they arrived. The harbor doing the work the roads no longer could. Others gambled on the land routes while gaps still existed. Cars strung into caravans and driven fast between walls of fire that had not yet closed the gap between them, reaching Ellsworth in the hours before that gap sealed shut. Both escapes worked because they were attempted at the last possible moment and not before. A day earlier, the boats would have gone out with the town still calm enough to wait. A day later, there would have been no water route left to use. Soldiers, sailors, airmen from Dow Air Force Base, and the National Guard unit out of Augusta arrived to reinforce a defense that had run out of local numbers. They took up positions alongside the town's own firefighters and forestry students sent down from the University of Maine, forming a line around the business district with the specific intention of holding it. Above the harbor, the cottages continued to fall to the fire regardless. It was a defense drawn narrowly, around a few blocks of shops and hotels rather than the town as a whole, because narrow was what the remaining manpower allowed. Then the wind turned. It was the same kind of shift that had ended the fire's quiet spell on the 17th, this time working the other way, and it moved the flames off the business district before the line committed to holding it was tested past its limit. The shops and hotels of downtown Bar Harbor survived the day the fire had been aimed at them. Above the town, the summer cottages did not have the same fortune, and neither did the grand hotels that had defined the island's summer season for 60 years, and neither did the year-round houses of people who had never owned a cottage at all. 3 different kinds of buildings, 3 different kinds of loss, burning on the same afternoon for the same reason. 5 residents died as a direct result of the fire. 2 were killed in a single car crash, driving in conditions no one would have chosen to drive in. 2 more died of heart attacks brought on by the strain of the days just past. The fire did not distinguish between these deaths and the buildings it took. The count simply grew until the wind stopped feeding it. When it was finished, the fire had burned 17,188 acres, roughly half of that total inside the boundaries of Acadia National Park. Of the island's 222 summer cottages, 67 were gone. 5 of the great hotels that had made Bar Harbor a name beyond Maine were gone with them. So were 170 houses belonging to people who lived there in every season, not just the fashionable one. The damage came to approximately $23 million, counted in the dollars of 1947. The fire that had started as a brush blaze on a dry October afternoon had, by the time the wind finally let it go, redrawn the outline of an island that summer visitors had spent 60 years building into something they called permanent. The smoke would clear within days. What replaced Bar Harbor's cottage colony would take considerably longer to determine, and not everyone who had built there intended to build again. Chapter 8. The Inventory of what remains. The rebuilding split cleanly along a line that had already been forming for 20 years. Year-round residents returned to their lots within a season or two, framing new houses on old foundations because the town was where they worked and where their children went to school. The summer families did not. A house that stood empty 11 months of the year had been a burden even before the fire took it, and the fire gave those families a reason they could state plainly instead of one. They had been quietly weighing since the stock crashed. The income tax had already made the old arrangement expensive to sustain. The Depression had already made it difficult to justify. Estates on Millionaires' Row had stood closed for entire summers through the 1930s, their owners unwilling to open them and unable to staff them at the scale a cottage of that size required. The fire did not end an era so much as complete a sentence that taxation and economic collapse had already begun writing. What burned in October 1947 had, in a practical sense, been dying since 1929. Millionaires' Row itself did not disappear as a place, only as an institution. Where a single continuous wall of private cottages had once faced the harbor, motels and small hotels rose in its place over the following decade, built for a different kind of visitor, the automobile tourist who stopped in Bar Harbor for a night on the way to somewhere else, replaced the financier, who had wintered on Fifth Avenue and summered here for the entire season. The address stayed the same. The clientele did not. The forest told its own version of the same story. The mature spruce and fir that had shaded the island for a century burned with the cottages, and in its place came birch, aspen, and oak, trees that grow fast in cleared ground and do not require the century the conifers had needed to reach their height. Every October now, hundreds of thousands of visitors arrive to see the red and gold that covers Acadia's hillsides. A display that exists in its present form because the fire cleared the ground for the trees that produce it. The forest the fire destroyed would not have burned this color. Bar Harbor today counts roughly 5,244 residents, a figure higher than the town ever reached at the height of the Gilded Age. The number alone would suggest recovery, even growth. It describes a different town. The 19th century version was a closed summer address, its population of cottagers counted in the low hundreds and its gates effectively private. The current version is a gateway, the point of entry for a national park that draws millions of visitors a year, open to anyone who can afford a room, rather than reserved for anyone who could afford to build one. A handful of the great cottages survived the fire outright, and a few of those still stand under new purposes. Wingwood House and Reverie Cove operate today as a hotel and a museum, their rooms and grounds available to whoever pays the rate posted at the desk. Neither was designed for that use. Both now serve it without apparent difficulty, which says something about how little the architecture cared, in the end, who was allowed inside. Rockefeller's 52 miles of carriage roads still wind through the second-growth forest above the harbor. Gravel surfaces maintained for a form of travel that had already gone out of fashion by the time the roads were finished. Horses and carriages once moved along them past cottages whose owners had specifically excluded automobiles from their private world. The roads outlasted that exclusion, the automobiles, and most of the cottages. Somewhere along one of them, a granite foundation sits low in a stand of young birch. Nothing marks whose house it was. Moss has taken the north-facing stones, and morning light comes through the birch canopy thin and white rather than the deep green shade the old spruce forest would have thrown. The foundation was built to hold up a cottage, designed to last for generations of a single family. It now holds up nothing, in a grove of trees that would not exist if that cottage had not burned. Granite remains. Wood does not.